Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here on behalf of the City of Chicago and the Department of Buildings. We're very excited that so many people are interested in this topic. In this presentation, we're going to cover Chicago's process for modernizing the building requirements and highlight some of the important changes for small residential buildings, but there's lots of material we won't be able to cover today. For those looking to learn more, there's many published resources. That's one of the advantages of moving towards alignment with national model codes. So there's lots of resources out there about understanding the international codes. Just a few are up on the screen. And in addition to these print resources that are out there, there's lots of programs. The department will be offering more programs. The home builders, as you heard, will be offering more programs, and other organizations will be offering programs over the course of the next year as we transition into this new code by the mandatory deadline of August 1st, 2020. When possible, we'll make recordings of those presentations available on our website, Department of Buildings, chicago.gov/buildings. It's in your email, it's up here on the screen. Also, we have email alerts. We don't try and fill your email box. Maybe it's about one a month. So you can sign up for that on our website. And also, as Paul said, there's a page with specific information, all the links related to code modernization. It's that sort of horizontal picture a little bit down the page on the Department of Buildings website. I think it's a sunset. It probably should be a sunrise, but we'll work on getting a better picture for that. There's also already on that page, there's a link to videos of a session we did in May with AIA Chicago, a general introduction to the code and some specific definitions and walking through what that is. So if you haven't already seen that, I'd recommend it. So the 2015 to 2021 code modernization process. Under the leadership of Commissioner Friedland, the Department of Buildings began a multi-year effort a few years ago now to comprehensively update the Chicago Building Code, now the Chicago Construction Codes. And the first phase of that, the city adopted updated electrical and conveyance device or elevator code requirements in 2017 and 2018. Because these new codes were developed with input from a range of industry stakeholders, the implementation was remarkably smooth. And both of those codes had about a 6-month phase-in period. We have a slightly longer period with the codes that are coming next. That brings us to phase 2, the core requirements for constructing and rehabbing buildings, including fire protection, structural, energy efficiency. Some of these parts of the building code have not been comprehensively revised since 1949. That's 70 years, so there's certainly been interim amendments, but it's a little bit piecemeal in our code today. And recognizing that, we also were aware that Chicago was the last city in the country not to be aligned with the International Building Code. So after a couple of starts, as Paul has mentioned, over the last several years, we finally got there this year. We'll be covering phase 2, the codes that are up on the screen, in more detail later this morning. But just to acknowledge, there is still more to do. Plumbing and mechanical are currently in the planning phases. We're hoping to work on those codes starting in 2020 and have them phase in with changes in 2021, which will get us through this current cycle. Also touching some things about signs and trade licensing as final pieces to this code modernization effort. For plumbing, probably some of you in the room are aware of the department's plumbing pilot program that we launched about a year ago, a little over a year. That allows the use of PVC for drain, waste, and vent piping in certain buildings up to 4 stories, a little bit broader than we've allowed in the past. That saved owners documented 15 million plus to date, and that pilot program will remain in place until we have permanent plumbing code changes, whenever those come next year or later. The city is also committed to a number of zoning reforms that the mayor is starting to work on with the Department of Planning and Development. We won't be covering those today, but those will be coming too, and part of the city's commitment to working on affordable housing, attainable housing, all sorts of housing, and making our requirements more user-friendly. So phase 2 would not have been possible without the tremendous amount of industry support that we had, a range of groups. Over 100 groups, firms were involved in the process, including our host today, the Home Builders Association of Greater Chicago, Our former mayor brought all of those groups together, groups that sometimes don't always play nice, brought them into a room in December and made very clear in a memorable way that he wanted this part of the code done before he left office. And ordinance did pass in April. So between December and March, the city had a draft that it had been working on internally for about a year and a half before we started the more external process. But between December and March, the city's initial draft was reviewed and debated, sometimes line by line, by 6 technical working groups. And yes, they did meet in December and almost didn't take a break for holidays because that's what the schedule demanded. So over 70 volunteer architects and engineers. We have 2 of them here this morning. Lou and Carl, my co-presenters this morning, co-chaired 2 of those 6 working groups. We couldn't have done it without them. And then it advanced to City Council. It was introduced in March, it passed in April, and it's already started to phase in. So the first thing that phased in was probably the more minor of the changes. So Chicago's energy code, it's updated in the past. It updated again from being based on the 2015 edition to the 2018 edition. It incorporates the 2018 edition of the International Energy Conservation Code and then also the Illinois amendments. Chicago's roof requirements that have been out there for a while about reflective roofs or green roofs are still there. They've just moved to the roofing chapter of the new building code. In July, new administrative provisions took effect, streamlining the process and the language governing the processes about topics like permit issuance, inspections, stop work orders, and things like that. So those are more internally focused for getting the department ready for this code change. It's largely preserving how those processes worked in the past. The biggest changes, the ones you're most interested in, I think, are the new building code and the new building rehabilitation code. Those become optional on December 1st of this year and mandatory for permit applications started on or after August 1st of 2020. So we still have about a year before they become required, but there are 2 changes that will take effect a little bit sooner than that. The first is for project with accessibility requirements, and I know small residential buildings that we're talking about today often don't have any. The new accessibility requirements drafted to align with the 2018 Illinois Accessibility Code, changes in the ADA since Chicago last updated its accessibility provisions, those will phase in and apply to all permit applications started on or after December 1st of this year. And then for residential buildings with 4 or more units, starting January 1st of 2020 for permit applications started on or after January 1st of 2020, new residential buildings with 4 or more units will have to have a sprinkler system. There's also some specialized requirements if you have co-living or other changes of use. This resolves a long-standing confusion, interaction between the Illinois Fire Code and Chicago's building code. We're currently working with the International Code Council, ICC, to publish user-friendly versions of the Chicago Code, so taking Chicago's amendments, which you can find online now, and integrating them with the model code text in one book. So we expect the books will look something like this, what's up on the screen. There will be a free read-only version available to the public online, and then you will be able to buy print or downloadable electronic versions from ICC. So if you work on small residential buildings, what's important to know? First, Chicago did not adopt a residential code separately from the building code. So you may be familiar with suburbs or other places that enforce a version of the International Residential Code. We aren't going to have an equivalent of that here. In Chicago, requirements for small residential buildings will be integrated into the building code book. To accomplish that, we created a Chicago occupancy classification R5. So you're familiar with the IBC, it has occupancy classification R1, R2, R3, R4. R5 is going to be 1 to 3 unit residential buildings, non-transient up to 4 stories, and associated garages. Townhouses will qualify if they're in groups of 3, or if every group of 3 is separated by a 4-hour firewall. If they're larger groups of townhouses without that, or larger apartment buildings with 4 or more units, then they'll be group R2, consistent with the IBC. What requirements are different for group R5? So recognizing that different requirements Recognizing that generally accessibility requirements don't apply unless the project receives zoning approval through the plan development process, accessibility generally won't apply. Of course, the city always encourages accessible design features or universal design features where possible. Sprinklers also will not be required in Group R5 buildings, 1 to 3 unit buildings as today. Also as today, there will be bonuses or exiting trade-offs in buildings that do have sprinkler systems, and NFPA 13D, which are generally only allowed for 1 and 2 unit buildings, will be allowed in 3 unit buildings up to 3 stories to get those same trade-off benefits in Chicago. While today the wind engineering requirements in the Chicago Code are the same for a 1-story single-family home and a 15-story hospital, in the new code, those standards for single-family homes for small residential buildings will be reduced, consistent with the national standard, ASCE 7. It's about a 20% reduction, although it's not perfect math. Seismic will apply to some larger buildings in Chicago. You may hear that. Seismic is coming, but for small residential buildings, seismic is never going to control, and for 1 to 3 unit buildings, you can ignore it entirely. There's also some prescriptive options out there in the IBC that are available for these small residential buildings if they're wood or metal frame. Standards for private porches and decks, also balconies, will be changed to be more consistent with national codes. So when it's a shared or common porch or deck, it will have the same standards today, 100 pounds per square foot. But a private balcony, deck, porch for a single family home, for example, will be reduced to a design live load of 60 pounds per square foot. The minimum guardrail height is also changing in residential units up to 3 stories. That's reduced from 42 inches today to 36, again consistent with the residential requirements applied elsewhere.
The minimum ceiling height within a dwelling unit will also be reduced from 7'6" today to 7 feet. We expect this will make it easier to legally convert existing basement or attic space without expensive excavation or structural changes.
R5, Chicago, current provisions for steeper stairs, tighter winders will also remain in effect, so I know that's important for building on our small lots especially. There are also some new provisions in this code for allowing lofts that would be accessible by stairs or ladders up to 150 square feet. And that applies within any type of dwelling unit if that's an option that is interested to you. And that comes from the model residential code. And in larger buildings, common stairs are going to be meeting those national rise-run standards. The other thing to keep in mind, IBC, IRC have this idea of egress windows that people are going to be exiting out their windows. We will not have that requirement in Chicago. Many of the exiting requirements say the same as they are today in terms of one exit and stair sizing, especially in these small residential buildings where our land development patterns are adapted to that. So now I'm going to turn things over to Lou Wilson to speak a little bit more about some of the projects that he works on all the time and give you some more detail about this new code.